you are seeing the presence of the scoliosis, so which is quite an essential thing, and not kind of an easy thing to tackle. However, even on the X-ray, I would bring your attention to the positive side. And the positive thing is that overall, if we look at the individual ribs and the total kind of system of the rib cage, so the rib cage holds quite well. So typically, this type of the scoliosis degree would be associated with more pronounced troubles at the level of the rib cage. So that is really, to a great extent, the effect of your ABR work. And also, when we look at the vertebral column itself, so the good thing about it is that, again, despite the curvature, which is very much associated with the pelvis, but if we look at the spines as such, at the vertebrae, so as we zoom in, we're going to see that the actual shapes of the ribs are actually, the actual shape of the vertebrae is quite good, and there are two big aspects there. So one aspect is the presence of the spaces between the individual vertebrae, which is good. And you can also see that the color is quite uniform. So, and also sort of, let's say, gray. It's not white. Because, again, typically, the scoliosis shows this whiteness. So let me show you kind of this thing, the typical, more or less typical progression of the scoliosis. So that's 9 years, that's 13 years. Well, I mean, that's getting taken from the web, when we see the evolution and the involution. So what you're seeing here, right, you're seeing that's what looked like relatively symmetrical part, but you can see already the whitening of the vertebrae. So that means that there are condensation of forces which is happening on the individual vertebra. So so that's why the color changes. So the bone becomes more kind of crystallized there. And then you can also see that in this typical scoliosis, so what happens, the ribs become much closer, right? And then also there is typically what you have those things where the curve has two sides, right? So it's the S curve of the scoliosis, which is more typical of that kind. And that's, the usual story. And well, unfortunately, well, that's kind of, if this is 9 years, 13 years, so that's 18 years. That sort of was a deformation that developed in that particular person. So where, what started as a collapse of the ribs and then whitening of the vertebral column then translated into this kind of collapse of the ribs and the further whitening. So obviously this is not the scenario that one wants, and this is type of scenarios that what we want to avoid. But my point is to show that this type of things, which kind of illustrate what happens very often with the scoliosis in the sort of this juvenile, the adolescent age, it's very important to pay attention not just to the curve, but to those factors like the spacing and the arrangement of the ribs and what's happening to the spine. So that's why when we look at Sonia's X-ray now, so the good thing about it is that at least if we look at the top ribs here, so the top parts, they're holding quite well. So you see we have some troubles at the bottom there, and that's why we will need to get this extra focus on it. And well, hopefully we'll be able to provide sufficient investment into this system in order to get the situation improved. Because you see, one of the bigger troubles for her is that very kind of low position of the iliacs in respect to the spines. Because you see, typically, if we look at the that's the view which is sort of more typical, right? So you see on the x-ray, so what you're seeing here, that typically the top of the pelvis comes in the like covers the number 5 and then comes to the middle of the vertebra number 4. So the challenge in Sophia that you can see here, that really that level kind of is low. That level is low, and it just sort of this entire area looks very compressed. So you see, if we count from here, so those would be the last ribs, and then you get the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you see that would be 5. It's easier for you to trace it from here, right? 11, 12. That's number 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's 5, right? So you see, instead of really coming higher at the level of the middle of the 4th, it's lower. And also you can see that these ligaments, which are supposed to divide the iliacs from the spine, that's the part which is not accentuated well. So in that respect, yes, it's an important thing for us would be to focus on the improvement of the rib stability, and really essential would be to get these divisions between the iliacs and the spines. And you also see here that's kind of a very visible difference of these triangles between the right and the left side, where on the left it's kind of more where it's more squashed. So but this is really what we need to deal with, so accentuating those divisions, looking at the total picture. So but as I said, we have some decent attachments further up, and if we look at the rib cage, it should be probably here. Yeah, these are the ribs. So you see, this is what is important to understand, that the ribs are all, like there are 3 classes of the ribs, from 1st to 7th. So they are the ones which are attached all the way to the sternum. So that's why they're called true ribs. So they are having this bone to be attached to. And then you've got this other 3 ribs which are called false ribs, and these ribs should be the extension of the true ones. So, and you can see they're called false because they are attaching to the cartilage, like a common cartilage which connects those ones, and they all connect to the rib number 7. But here in between there are ligaments which are supposed to hold them well to each other. And if they're not holding them to each other well enough, then that's where we face the problems, because then instead of working together with the strong ribs and then also thus holding strongly, these ribs unfortunately then start following more these loose ribs, the floating ribs, the ones that are not connected. So, and then they start to turn. So, and then instead of kind of having the stability, which is having 10 stable ribs and just 2 floating, effectively the person ends up in this troubled situation when you have just 7 ribs and then 5 unstable ones. So, and it's obvious that that's much more difficult to control. So, and that's what we see here. If you start looking at the ribs, and doing the count, you would see that it's the last two ribs which are not so well attached, and you can see it here particularly well. See this joint here of the number 11 is really not holding well on the left side. So that's the challenge. And then, if you count from there, you see that would be number 10, which is not holding well. Well, 9 and 8 are better, but this is really the trouble. So we need to address those connections as well. And what you're seeing, so that also corresponds to the level where the real sort of more significant curve starts. So that's an important thing to work with, and that's kind of the specifics which we need to trace and monitor. And